1,000,000 men, 1,000 miles in a month. The German Imperial Army, the finest war machine the world had ever known, was sweeping through Europe like a scythe. Brussels had fallen. The French government was fleeing. The dust of the approaching German columns was settling on the suburbs of Paris itself. The clock was ticking on the French Republic, but the plan was already failing. This is the story of how an army of sick men, sacked generals, and drivers demanding taxi fares stopped the greatest military machine in history. This crushing defeat had been foretold by the Schlieffen plan, a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble to knock out France within 6 weeks. The entire German strategy was predicated on speed and the absolute inability of the enemy to recover from the initial assault. For 3 terrifying weeks in the late summer of 1914, the plan looked unstoppable. The German armies advanced at a terrifying pace, overwhelming everything in their path. The French counterattacks, based on outdated Napoleonic doctrine and fierce, brightly colored uniforms, were instantly obliterated in the Battle of the Frontiers, resulting in catastrophic casualties. The British Expeditionary Force, a relatively tiny but professional contingent of only about 125,000 men, was driven into a hasty, grueling retreat. The German victory seemed assured. Colonel Gerhard Tappen, one of their chief strategists, announced to his colleagues on August 25th, "In 6 weeks, we shall finish the job." The entire 20th century hinged on this time frame. If Paris fell, if the French government collapsed, the war would be lost almost before it had truly begun. The crisis reached its peak in the final days of August. As the German columns closed in, the French government, believing the capital indefensible, announced its official plan to abandon Paris for the city of Bordeaux. This was a profound symbol of capitulation. Simultaneously, Sir John French, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, telegraphed London, requesting permission to pull his remaining forces out of the line entirely. The Allies had been beaten so thoroughly that their nerves seemed on the point of snapping. There was no plan, no hope, and no unified leadership left. Only retreat. But the speed of the German advance concealed a fatal vulnerability, a flaw written into the Schlieffen plan itself. The logistical train simply could not keep pace with the frontline infantry. German soldiers, marching 200 miles in 3 weeks, were utterly spent. They hadn't seen a full night's sleep in weeks. Half their supply lorries had broken down, their wheels choked by the dust of the French roads. Their thousands of horses, essential for hauling artillery and supplies, were dropping dead from sheer exhaustion. Men carried 70-pound packs, their new ill-fitting footwear creating horrendous blisters in the summer heat. They were fighting on sheer willpower, hungry, unwashed, and disorganized. Their long columns, once the picture of Prussian precision, were becoming ragged and exhausted. They were not an invincible army. They were an army at the absolute limit of its endurance, stretching its supply lines until they were threadbare. The fate of the entire Allied project suddenly depended on the resolve of a handful of key figures, none of whom looked particularly heroic. The first was General Joseph Simon Gallieni, a 66-year-old veteran and the newly appointed military governor of Paris. Gallieni was severely ill with prostate cancer, his health failing, his wife recently deceased. The British Chancellor, David Lloyd George, noted that Gallieni looked sallow, shrunken, and haunted. Yet this dying man took on the defense of Paris as his final, personal mission. Having fought and been captured by the Germans in the 1870 Franco-Prussian conflict, the stakes were profoundly personal. He ordered Paris mobilized as an armed camp, preparing to fight not just from the outer defenses, but from every street corner. and issued a brilliantly terse proclamation to the citizens. "Residents of Paris, I have received the mandate to defend Paris against the invader. This mandate I shall carry out to the end." His defiance was absolute. If you find this story of high-stakes political and military drama compelling, please remember to click the link and subscribe to the channel. We cover the pivot moments in history that changed the world. The second figure, and the ultimate mastermind of the turnaround, was the French commander-in-chief, Joseph-Jacques Césaire Joffre. Joffre had, by all accounts, presided over a disastrous start to the war, a series of costly tactical blunders that had earned him the internal nickname of the Butcher. Yet, Joffre possessed one invaluable quality that separated him from the collapsing German general staff, who were physically breaking down from stress and illness: unbelievable calm. While everyone around him, from his officers to the government, was gripped by panic, Joffre maintained an almost Buddha-like serenity, fueled by enormous daily lunches. He refused to be drawn into the general hysteria, trusting his maps more than the panicked reports flooding his headquarters. The historian Max Hastings would later note that Joffre's unbelievable calm was about to transfer him from abattoir superintendent to Allied savior. But Joffre knew calm was not enough. To win, he had to fire the entire French High Command, and then he had to force the British to fight. The stage for the ultimate confrontation was set, but Joffre still lacked a target. Joffre recognized the exhaustion and logistical strain of the German advance, seeing an opportunity where others saw only defeat. His first move was brutal and necessary. He sacked dozens of his generals, purging his staff of anyone tainted by failure and replacing them with younger, hungrier officers desperate to prove themselves. He then focused on the British. When Sir John French sent his desperate telegram to London, the British cabinet was genuinely shocked. Instead of authorizing a full withdrawal, they stood firm and dispatched the ultimate force of authority, Field Marshal Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, known for his formidable demeanor and iconic mustache. Kitchener arrived in Paris and summoned Sir John French to the British Embassy. The two men, who despised each other, met in a tense, uncomfortable standoff. Kitchener, wearing his Field Marshal uniform to emphasize his civilian and official authority, cut French off immediately. There would be no retreat to the Channel ports. French would stay in the line and cooperate with his French comrades. Kitchener's intervention, a political act of defiance, was enough to steady the British commander's nerve and keep the 125,000-man force exactly where the French needed them to be. Joffre, with the British pinned back in the line and a fresh slate of junior, hungry French commanders in place, was ready to strike. He had one critical advantage. The Germans, blinded by their own success, were about to break their own plan. The original Schlieffen blueprint mandated a wide, sweeping movement around the west of Paris to completely encircle the capital. But German field commanders, particularly General Karl von Bülow of the Second Army, felt they were so close to victory that they could cut the corner. Instead, they began to turn their massive forces inward, aiming to crush the retreating Allied armies against the French border. This maneuver created a colossal, unforgivable mistake. A gap opened between von Bülow's Second Army and Alexander von Kluck's First Army, the huge right-wing force. A chasm 25 miles wide was developing in the German line, and von Kluck, obsessed with chasing the retreating British, was unknowingly exposing his entire flank to Paris. The Allies knew the gap existed, but knowing where the enemy might be was useless. They needed certainty. And on September 1st, the German army, through sheer luck, delivered their own execution order. On September 1st, the Allies received a gift that confirmed this blunder. A staff officer of the French Fifth Army was handed a blood-drenched backpack taken from the body of a German cavalry officer. Inside the pack was a map, clearly marked with pencil, showing the exact deployment of von Kluck's First Army, and confirming that he was turning inward, away from the capital, straight toward the exposed Allied flank. This stunning piece of intelligence, confirming the greatest blunder of the war, was the moment Joffre had been waiting for. Supported by intercepted German signals from the high antennae on the Eiffel Tower, which was proving to be an essential military listening post, Joffre finalized his counterplan. On the evening of September 4th, he issued General Order Number 6. The entire Allied line would stop retreating, turn around, and attack. The plan was not to meet the German advance head-on, but to concentrate all forces against the exposed First Army and thrust a wedge directly between von Kluck and von Bülow. For this plan to work, Joffre needed the British Expeditionary Force to act as the spearhead of that wedge. With the fate of the nation hanging in the balance, Joffre drove in his car to the chateau where Sir John French was staying. The conversation that followed was one of the most melodramatic and consequential exchanges of the entire war. Joffre, rarely one for theatrical outbursts, set out his plan, describing the immense battlefield and the Germans blundering blindly on, hastening to their fate. Then, turning to the red-faced Sir John French, Joffre let his voice tremble with passion, thumping the table as he pleaded, "The lives of all French people, the soil of France, the future of Europe depends on you joining this battle. I cannot believe the British Army will refuse to do its share in this supreme crisis. France is begging you. The honor of England is at stake." The room fell into a long, agonizing silence. French, overcome with emotion, tears streaming down his face, stammered in broken French before finally turning to his officer and saying, "Damn it, I can't explain. Tell him that all that men can do, our fellows will do." The Field Marshal said yes. Joffre drove back to his headquarters and gathered his junior officers, some of whom were still deeply skeptical. He delivered the final chilling order to his 1,000,000 men that night. It's now or never. It's victory or death. Gentlemen, we shall fight on the Marne. His troops were told that those who could no longer advance must keep the ground that had been won at any cost. They must die where they stand, rather than give way. Simultaneously, back in Paris, the ailing General Gallieni gave his subordinates a similar command. When asked where the defensive line should retreat to if overwhelmed, Gallieni's answer was stark. Nowhere. We fight to the death. At dawn on September 6th, 1914, the battle began. The front, stretching 150 miles from the suburbs of Paris east to the great fortress of Verdun, erupted. Thousands of guns fired in a combined artillery barrage that created a noise the world had never heard before, the greatest man-made storm in history. For hours, the ground shook under the relentless pounding. Tens of thousands of Frenchmen poured forward, the sheer elan of the French combined with the industrial might of their guns. This was the beginning of the miracle on the Marne. But victory was not immediate. The battle was massive, fragmented, and brutal. As the fight raged, General Gallieni in Paris faced an immediate crisis. The railway network was entirely clogged with supply trains, wounded soldiers, and refugees. An entire infantry division, the 7th, was stuck in a northern suburb, urgently needed at the front, miles away. Army lorries were non-existent. In a moment of sheer improvisation, an idea surfaced. Taxis. Paris normally had 10,000 taxicabs. Only about 3,000 were still operating. But Gallieni seized the opportunity. He commanded his officers to commandeer every single taxi in the city and send them to the Esplanade des Invalides. Police immediately fanned out, flagging down the Renault taxis, kicking out the passengers, and telling the drivers to proceed to the military college. These were the famed taxis of the Marne. Most of the soldiers loading into the cars had never been in an automobile, as taxis in 1914 were strictly a luxury reserved for the rich. The convoy, eventually swelling to about 400 vehicles, including buses and even a few civilian racing cars, drove through the night. The drivers were deeply unhappy, complaining about losing their fares and having to drive with their headlights off, frequently bumping into each other. But the sight of the taxis, transporting 4,000 desperately needed men, became one of the great, lasting legends of French patriotic solidarity, a symbol of the common man driving the invader from sacred soil. Though historically, the 4,000 men had little tactical impact on the battle's overall outcome, the sheer audacity of the event became a vital, spiritual victory for the French people. What do you think was the most audacious improvisation of the war? Let us know in the comments below. The actual battle was won not by legendary taxi rides, but by relentless, brutal fighting and the enemy's exhaustion. On the western side, the French Fifth Army absolutely battered von Bülow's German Second Army. In the center, the fighting was so tight and desperate that Ferdinand Foch, commanding the Ninth Army, issued one of the war's most famous messages. "Excellent. My center is giving way. My right is retreating. Situation excellent. I am going to attack." The victory would be a test of nerve, not maneuver. The German soldiers, exhausted, simply stopped, lay down, and fell asleep where they stood. The Allies were equally shattered, and as the weather broke, heavy rain and fog descended on the field, creating a true fog of war. Neither side knew where the other was. The true breakthrough came behind the lines. German communication had utterly failed. There was no cable link between von Kluck and von Bülow. Their supreme commander, General Helmuth von Moltke, a man already prone to sickness and depressive anxiety, was 150 miles away in Luxembourg, relying on fragmented wire reports. In a massive panic, Moltke dispatched an emissary to the front, the obscure Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hensch, an intelligence officer tasked with assessing the crisis. Hensch's subsequent journey became the most disastrous drive in German military history. Hensch first reached von Bülow's Second Army headquarters. There, he found von Bülow in a massive funk, exhausted and sick, convinced his troops were being reduced to cinders. Von Bülow, whose nerve had completely snapped, was talking openly about total catastrophe, breaking down into floods of tears on multiple occasions. Hensch, who had been given the authority by Moltke to approve a withdrawal, sanctioned the retreat of the Second Army on the morning of September 9th. Hensch then continued 50 miles west to von Kluck's First Army. It was a terrifying drive. The roads were choked with terrified refugees and disoriented wounded soldiers. Von Kluck's officers were confident they could handle the British and win. But Hensch brought the stunning news. The Second Army was already retreating. If the First Army didn't pull back, their flank would be completely exposed. Stunned, von Kluck's staff reluctantly accepted the inevitable. The decision had been made, not by a heroic charge, but by a psychological collapse at the highest level of command. If you have a friend who is fascinated by the hidden decisions that turn the tide of war, share this video with them. Later that day, the French advanced on where the Second Army had been and were astounded. The German force had simply vanished. In their wake, they left behind equipment, rubbish, and, in one telling detail, an unbelievable quantity of empty wine bottles. The Germans were pulling back. The miracle had happened. When the retreating German soldiers received the orders to go backward, they were devastated, confused, and angry. They did not feel like a beaten army. They felt confused and betrayed by a mysterious command from the rear. They felt victory had been stolen from them. The immediate consequences of the miracle on the Marne were profound. Moltke, who had been weeping and pacing in his headquarters, was immediately fired by the Kaiser, replaced by the colder, more realistic Erich von Falkenhayn. The Schlieffen plan, the grand strategy of the German Empire, was ruined forever. The invasion of France had been halted, but the German armies retreated in good order, not as a routed mob. They halted just above the River Ain, on a long chalk ridge, where they did the one thing the Schlieffen plan was designed to prevent. They started digging. Within days, the three core elements of the long war became terrifyingly clear. First, the primacy of artillery, men cowering under shell fire for days. Second, the trenches. The chalk was easy to dig, and the Germans, who were planning to hold their captured industrial territory, dug deep, strong defensive positions. Third, the sense of interminable hopelessness settled in. The initial thrilling movement of the war was over. The trenches soon stretched all the way to the Swiss border. A brief, frantic race to the sea ensued as both sides tried to flank each other in the north, extending the lines until they ran out of land at a medieval town that represented the last hope of a German breakthrough. Ypres. The victory on the Marne was not just a battle won, it was the victory of resolution over fear. It was the moment the quick, sweeping war ended and the long, grinding war began. But the final consequence was the most poisonous. The German soldiers who retreated did not feel beaten. They felt betrayed. This quiet retreat planted the seed of the stab-in-the-back myth, a lie that would consume Germany for decades. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles that shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.